In the summer of 1983, Anchorage, Alaska, still felt like the kind of place where people trusted strangers more than they should. The city sat surrounded by enormous stretches of wilderness, where highways disappeared into forests and small planes crossed overhead almost every hour. People working in bars, diners, repair shops, and fishing docks all seemed to know each other in some way. And because Alaska was so isolated, residents got used to the idea that sometimes people simply left town without warning, especially the girls working along 4th Avenue. That stretch of Anchorage was crowded at night with bars, cheap motels, and people trying to make enough money to survive another week. Runaways drifted through there constantly, along with dancers and teenagers who had nowhere else to go. If one of them disappeared for a few days, most people barely noticed at first. But by 1983, several women had already vanished under strange circumstances. Some were later discovered in remote areas outside the city, while others were never found at all. The disappearances didn't seem connected in the beginning because the man responsible looked completely ordinary. He owned a bakery, hunted on weekends, and was known around town as quiet and awkward more than anything else. Neighbors waved to him when he drove through town, and customers spoke highly of him. He didn't come across as intimidating or unpredictable. If anything, he seemed forgettable. Then, on June 13th, 1983, a 17-year-old girl named Cindy Paulson was standing along 4th Avenue when a middle-aged man approached her with an offer of money. At first, nothing about him felt especially dangerous. He spoke calmly, acted polite, and didn't stand out from the other men driving through the area that night. So Cindy got into the car, expecting a routine encounter. A few moments later, the man suddenly pulled out a revolver. The atmosphere inside the vehicle changed immediately. He drove her away from downtown Anchorage toward a quiet residential neighborhood, then forced her into his house once they arrived. Inside, he restrained her and kept her captive in the basement. At one point, the man actually fell asleep on a nearby couch, while she remained trapped only a few feet away. Investigators would later realize that detail mattered because it showed how comfortable and experienced he was. Eventually, the man woke up and marched Cindy back outside to his car. He drove her across Anchorage to Merrill Field, a small airport mostly used by private pilots and bush planes. Sitting on the tarmac was a small aircraft already prepared for takeoff. While the man loaded equipment into the cockpit, Cindy sat restrained in the back seat, watching him move around the plane. Somewhere during those few seconds, she realized that if he managed to get her airborne, nobody would ever find her again. So the moment his back was turned, she opened the car door and ran. Barefoot and still restrained, she sprinted toward the nearest road while the man chased after her. She managed to flag down a passing truck, and the driver immediately noticed how terrified she looked. He pulled her inside and drove her away from the airport area before contacting authorities. By the time police located Cindy at a nearby motel, she was still wearing the restraints. She gave investigators a detailed description of the man who kidnapped her, and police quickly identified a suspect. But when detectives questioned him, the case almost stalled immediately. The man calmly claimed the girl was lying because he had refused to give her money, insisting she was trying to extort him. He acted irritated more than nervous, and his explanation sounded believable enough that some officers hesitated to push harder. After all, the suspect wasn't some drifter hiding in the woods. He was a married businessman who owned a bakery. Under normal circumstances, the investigation might have faded there. But another investigator had already been looking into something much larger happening around Anchorage. Over the previous few years, women had been discovered in wooded areas, gravel pits, and isolated stretches of land outside the city. Some had vanished after being offered money for photographs or companionship. Others disappeared after leaving clubs or motels late at night. And one Alaska state trooper believed the same person was responsible for all of it. That investigator was Glenn Floth. He noticed patterns other detectives overlooked, especially how comfortable the killer seemed operating deep in the wilderness. Many of the women had been found in locations difficult to access without serious outdoor experience. Some areas were reachable only by boat or aircraft. Floeth eventually contacted the FBI and requested a criminal profile from profiler John E. Douglas. After reviewing the evidence, Douglas gave investigators a profile that felt disturbingly specific. He believed the killer was likely an experienced hunter with low self-esteem and a history of rejection by women. He also suspected the person might stutter, behave awkwardly around others, and possibly keep trophies from victims. The description narrowed the suspect list dramatically because one local man seemed to fit nearly every category. The quiet bakery owner suddenly looked far more dangerous than he had before. Investigators went back through the man's history and discovered earlier arrests involving assault, attempted abduction, and sexual violence. None of the cases had completely destroyed his reputation, and somehow he always managed to return to normal life afterward. Meanwhile, women around Anchorage continued disappearing. This time, police secured a search warrant for his house, vehicles, and airplane. What they found inside completely changed the investigation. Hidden throughout the property were firearms, jewelry belonging to missing women, and a collection of personal items investigators immediately recognized. But the most disturbing discovery was an aviation map hidden inside the house. Scattered across the chart were dozens of handwritten X marks. Detectives began comparing the locations to known crime scenes and quickly realized several matched places where remains had already been discovered. The map appeared to be documenting burial sites. At first, the suspect denied everything, but once investigators confronted him with the map and the recovered evidence, he slowly began confessing piece by piece. The way he described the crimes disturbed investigators even more because he spoke about them almost casually. He explained that he would approach vulnerable women around Anchorage and offer them money for photographs or companionship. Then he would abduct them and transport them into isolated wilderness areas. In several cases, he flew women deep into remote sections of Alaska, using his small private plane. Some were taken into forests and riverbeds before being killed in isolated wilderness areas. Investigators later believed he treated the crimes with a disturbing level of detachment, almost like outdoor excursions rather than acts of violence. And because Alaska was so massive and empty, many had virtually no chance of escape once they reached those remote areas. Authorities eventually connected him to at least 17 murders, though investigators believed the true number might have been much higher. Some women vanished after agreeing to meet a man for photo shoots, while others disappeared after leaving clubs late at night. Several remains were discovered months or even years later in isolated wooded areas. Others were never recovered at all. Throughout the entire period, the killer continued running his bakery and living what appeared to be a completely normal life. Customers bought bread from him every morning without realizing violent crimes had taken place inside his home. Neighbors waved to him while investigators searched forests for missing women. And when police later traveled with him through parts of Alaska, he calmly pointed out burial sites marked on the map hidden in his house. In several locations, remains were found exactly where he claimed they would be. In others, years of weather and wildlife had erased nearly everything. Eventually, the man accepted a plea agreement and confessed to multiple murders in exchange for avoiding a full public trial. He received a sentence totaling more than 400 years in prison without the possibility of parole. And only after the investigation ended did the public fully learn the identity of the quiet baker, who had spent years turning the Alaskan wilderness into a place people vanished from without explanation. His name was Robert Hansen, the man who abducted women, flew them deep into a remote area of Alaska, and left them stranded with the false hope they might still escape, never realizing there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no realistic way out before he came after them again. In the spring of 2011, downtown Bethesda felt like one of the safest places in the country. The streets stayed busy late into the evening with people leaving restaurants, carrying shopping bags, or stopping for coffee before heading home. Bethesda Avenue in particular looked polished and expensive, lined with bright storefronts and upscale retail shops that stayed crowded well after dark. Nothing about the area suggested violence, and absolutely nothing about the small yoga clothing store near the center of the block suggested that within a few hours, it would become the scene of one of the most disturbing murders in recent memory. On the evening of March 11th, employees inside the Lululemon Athletica store were finishing their normal closing routine. 2 co-workers remained inside after the store shut down for the night, Jana Murray and another employee who worked alongside her. Like most retail workers closing a store, the final hour was spent doing ordinary things, folding clothes, counting registers, cleaning displays, and checking inventory. It was the kind of repetitive work nobody remembers afterward, because it feels completely routine at the time. Part of that nightly routine involved employees checking each other's bags before leaving the store. It was a standard anti-theft policy used in many retail stores, and employees were expected to follow it no matter how awkward it felt. That night, during the check, Jana reportedly discovered a pair of unpaid leggings inside her co-worker's bag. She contacted a manager about it before leaving the store. The manager told her they would handle the situation the following morning. At the time, it probably felt uncomfortable, but not life-threatening. A short time later, Jana received a phone call. Her co-worker explained that she had accidentally forgotten something inside the store and needed to be let back in. So despite already leaving for the night, Jana turned around and went back to unlock the doors. Surveillance and alarm records later confirmed the store was reopened around 10 p.m. From the outside, everything still appeared completely normal. Cars passed through Bethesda Avenue, while nearby restaurants remained open late into the night. Then, somewhere inside that store, an argument started. Next door, employees inside the Apple store began hearing strange noises through the shed wall. At first, it sounded like 2 women arguing. One employee later described hearing a voice repeatedly saying, "Talk to me, don't do this, talk to me, what's going on?" Then the sounds became louder. Crashing noises echoed through the wall, followed by screaming and what sounded like someone being dragged across the floor. At one point, another weak voice could reportedly be heard pleading, "God help me, please help me." But nobody called the police. One manager later admitted he assumed it was just drama happening next door. A security guard sat nearby listening to music on an iPod, while the noises continued through the wall. Outside, people walked past the storefront without realizing anything was wrong. The attack reportedly lasted a long time, long enough that investigators later believed there were multiple opportunities for someone nearby to hear it. But eventually, the sound stopped, and the entire block grew quiet again. The following morning, a manager arrived at the store and immediately noticed something felt wrong. The front door was unlocked. Clothing and merchandise were scattered everywhere. Mannequins had been knocked over, and displays were overturned across the sales floor. The scene looked chaotic, almost like a robbery or break-in had happened overnight. Then the manager heard someone moaning somewhere deeper inside the store. Terrified, she ran outside and asked a passing man to come help her search the building. Together, they carefully moved toward the back hallway. That was when they discovered Jana Murray lying face down in a pool of blood. Nearby, another employee was found inside the bathroom, barely conscious, with zip ties around her wrists and ankles and blood covering part of her face. At first glance, it appeared the 2 women had both been attacked by intruders during the night, leaving one dead and the other barely alive. And initially, investigators treated the surviving employee as a victim. When police began interviewing the surviving employee, she gave them a terrifying story. According to her account, after returning to the store the previous night, 2 masked men wearing dark clothing suddenly entered and attacked both women. She claimed the men assaulted them, tied them up, and spent hours inside the store before finally leaving. The scene around them appeared to support the story at first. Bloody footprints stretched across the floor, merchandise had been thrown everywhere, and both women showed signs of injury. But almost immediately, detectives began noticing things that didn't make sense. The injuries between the two women were drastically different. Jana Murray had suffered an absolutely brutal attack involving hundreds of wounds inflicted with multiple weapons found inside the store. Investigators later determined she had been struck, stabbed, and beaten over and over again during a prolonged struggle. Meanwhile, the surviving employee's injuries were surprisingly minor by comparison. Doctors and forensic experts soon concluded many of them appeared consistent with self-inflicted wounds rather than injuries caused during a violent assault. Then investigators noticed something strange about the blood on her face. A forensic analyst later testified that the blood from a cut on her forehead had flowed straight downward in clean lines. That detail suggested she had spent much of the night upright rather than lying helpless on the floor as she claimed. Detectives also examined the bloody footprints throughout the store and discovered they came from only 2 sets of shoes: the surviving employee's shoes and a large pair of men's sneakers found inside the building. Even stranger, the footprints never actually exited the store. As investigators dug deeper, more pieces of the story started collapsing. Despite claims that both women had been sexually assaulted, medical examinations found no evidence supporting that claim. Detectives later discovered that someone had deliberately damaged Jana Murray's clothing to stage the appearance of an assault. Police also found blood inside Jana's vehicle parked several blocks away. When questioned about it, the surviving employee claimed the masked men forced her to move the car and threatened to kill Jana if she didn't return quickly enough. But even that explanation created more problems. According to her own story, she had been outside alone moving the vehicle through downtown Bethesda, while multiple businesses remained open nearby. At one point, she even admitted seeing a police officer while driving the car. Yet she never tried to escape, never yelled for help, and never told anyone what had supposedly happened inside the store. By that stage, investigators were beginning to suspect the entire crime scene had been staged from the beginning. Eventually, detectives uncovered what likely triggered the attack. Earlier that night, during the standard employee bag check, Jana Murray had discovered stolen merchandise inside her co-worker's bag and reported it to management. Investigators believed the confrontation humiliated the other employee and triggered a violent rage once the 2 women returned to the store alone. Prosecutors later argued that after the murder, the attacker spent hours trying to transform the scene into something resembling a robbery carried out by unknown men. According to investigators, the killer threw merchandise across the floor, overturned displays, scattered cleaning tools, and wore a pair of men's shoes to create false footprints through the blood. She zip-tied her own wrists and ankles, injured herself, and pretended to be unconscious when the store manager arrived the following morning. The entire scene had been carefully designed to redirect suspicion away from her, and for a short period of time, it almost worked. But as forensic evidence continued dismantling the story piece by piece, detectives finally arrested the surviving employee 1 week after the murder. Her name was Brittany Norwood. In 2012, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole for the killing of Jana Murray. By the end of the investigation, one of the most unsettling parts of the entire case was realizing how close the stage scene came to convincing everyone that the killer had actually been another victim. In March of 1989, thousands of American college students were heading towards South Padre Island for spring break. Every year, the beaches filled with crowds from universities across Texas and the rest of the country. Beer companies sponsored concerts and contests while bars stayed packed until sunrise. Students crossed the border into Matamoros almost casually, moving back and forth between Texas and Mexico for cheaper drinks and larger crowds. At the time, most people treated it like part of the experience. One of those students was Mark Kilroy, a 21-year-old pre-med student attending the University of Texas at Austin. Friends described him as athletic, outgoing, and responsible. He had grown up in Santa Fe, played sports throughout high school, and planned to eventually become a doctor. Nothing about the trip stood out as unusual before he disappeared. In fact, by all accounts, the weekend looked completely ordinary. On March 10th, Mark and several close friends drove nearly 9 hours to South Padre Island after finishing exams. They checked into their hotel, spent time on the beach, met other college students, and stayed out late partying like everyone else around them. During the day, they watched contests near the shoreline and wandered through crowded hotel gatherings. At night, they crossed the border into Matamoros, along with thousands of other students. The entire town was overflowing with spring break tourists. By the evening of March 13th, the group had already made multiple trips into Mexico without problems. That night, they parked near the border again and crossed into Matamoros on foot. The streets were packed shoulder to shoulder with students moving between bars beneath neon lights and loud music. Crowds spilled onto the sidewalks while vendors shouted over each other from storefronts and restaurants. According to reports, nearly 15,000 American tourists were in the city that night alone. Mark and his friends eventually ended up at a crowded bar called London Pub, which had temporarily rebranded itself as Hard Rock Cafe for spring break. Inside, music blasted from the speakers while beer flew from the balcony onto people below. At some point, Mark became separated from his group while talking to several women near the bar. That wasn't especially alarming because the area was chaotic and crowded. Everyone kept drifting apart and reconnecting throughout the night. Around 2 a.m., Mark's friends decided it was time to head back toward the border crossing. When they stepped outside, they briefly saw Mark leaning against a car while talking to a woman he recognized from one of the beach contests earlier in the trip. One of his friends stopped nearby, while another ran into an alley to urinate before the group continued walking. The streets remained packed with tourists heading in every direction. Then, within only a few minutes, Mark was suddenly gone. At first, nobody panicked. His friends assumed he had probably wandered off with someone else or crossed back into Texas ahead of them. They searched nearby streets and bars for hours before eventually returning to South Padre Island. Even the next morning, they still believed there was a reasonable explanation. Spring break weekends were chaotic, and students disappearing overnight before turning up exhausted the next afternoon wasn't unusual. But as the hours passed with no sign of Mark, the situation started feeling wrong. Soon, police on both sides of the border became involved. Investigators retraced the group's movements through Matamoros and searched hospitals, jails, and nearby streets for any sign of him. Mark's parents traveled to South Texas and distributed thousands of flyers while volunteers joined the search effort. News coverage spread quickly across the United States because disappearances involving American students in Mexico always attracted attention. But despite all the publicity, investigators still had almost no solid leads. The case slowly became international news. Some investigators believed Mark had been robbed and murdered. Others suspected drug traffickers might have targeted him randomly. There were rumors he had been seen leaving with strangers, though none could be confirmed. One of his friends later underwent hypnosis to help investigators recover details from that night. Under hypnosis, he recalled a young Hispanic man approaching Mark shortly before he disappeared and asking him, "Don't I know you from somewhere?" But even that lead went nowhere. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, authorities in Mexico had stumbled into something entirely separate. On April 1st, nearly 3 weeks after Mark vanished, Mexican federal police operating a drug checkpoint noticed a truck speeding past without stopping. Instead of immediately pulling it over, officers followed the vehicle quietly through the countryside outside Matamoros. Eventually, the truck reached a remote ranch known as Santa Elena. The officers watched from a distance before deciding to move in and search the property. What they found there would completely change the investigation. Inside the ranch, investigators discovered traces of marijuana, along with strange ritual items scattered throughout the property. At first, police believed they had uncovered a small drug operation mixed with occult practices. But after several arrests and interrogations, one caretaker at the ranch identified Mark Kilroy from a photograph almost immediately. According to investigators, the caretaker calmly pointed toward a shack on the property and said he had seen the missing student there. That single statement transformed the case instantly. Under questioning, multiple suspects began confessing to horrifying details. They explained that Mark had not been chosen because of anything personal. Instead, members of the group had specifically been ordered to find a white American male for a ritual sacrifice. According to the confessions, several men blended into the spring break crowds in Matamoros on the night Mark disappeared. At some point, while he stood separated from his friends near the street, the group grabbed him and forced him into a truck. Investigators later learned Mark initially fought to escape. At one point, he reportedly broke free from the vehicle and tried to run. But another car carrying additional members of the group intercepted him only moments later. He was handcuffed, restrained, and driven through the outskirts of Matamoros toward the Santa Elena Ranch. Once there, he was kept alive overnight inside a vehicle while members of the group guarded him nearby. The following morning, one ranch worker reportedly brought Mark food and water. Hours later, several men arrived and wrapped his face with duct tape before leading him across the property toward a storage shack. According to confessions later given to police, Mark was tortured throughout the night. Eventually, he was brought outside and killed with a machete strike to the back of the head and neck. Afterward, members of the group mutilated and buried his body in a shallow grave on the property. But investigators soon realized Mark was not the only victim. When police forced suspects to help excavate the ranch grounds, they uncovered multiple mutilated bodies buried around the property. In total, authorities exhumed 15 corpses connected to killings that had occurred over several months. Several victims were believed to be rival drug traffickers, while others appeared connected to ritual sacrifices carried out by the group. Inside one metal pot, investigators found human remains mixed with animal blood and ritual materials used during ceremonies. The entire scene shocked both Mexican and American authorities. As news spread internationally, media coverage exploded. Television crews flooded South Texas and Matamoros, while newspapers around the world focused on the bizarre details surrounding the murders. At the center of the investigation was a charismatic cult leader connected to drug traffickers and occult rituals. He had convinced followers that human sacrifice granted supernatural protection from law enforcement and violence. Authorities believed his influence over the group was so strong that members obeyed almost anything he demanded. That man's name was Adolfo Constanzo. By the time investigators identified him, he had already fled to Mexico City with several loyal followers. What followed became a massive international manhunt involving both Mexican and American authorities. Rumors about his location spread constantly, with sightings reported in Texas, Florida, and other parts of Mexico. Meanwhile, police uncovered additional ritual chambers, altars, and evidence tying his organization to drug trafficking operations along the border. Eventually, investigators tracked Constanzo to an apartment complex in Mexico City. When police surrounded the building in May 1989, a violent standoff began inside the apartment. Constanzo opened fire on officers while several cult members barricaded themselves indoors. After nearly an hour, realizing capture was inevitable, Constanzo reportedly ordered one of his followers to kill him rather than allow police to take him alive. Moments later, gunfire erupted from inside the apartment. When officers finally entered the smoke-filled room, Adolfo Constanzo was dead alongside one of his closest followers. Several surviving cult members were arrested at the scene, including Sara Aldrete, who investigators believed had helped recruit members into the organization. In the years that followed, multiple participants were convicted on charges ranging from murder to drug trafficking, though several later claimed they had been tortured into confessing. For many people following the story in 1989, the most terrifying part wasn't just the brutality of the crimes, it was how ordinary the beginning felt. Alright guys, that will be it for today. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss next week's upload. I drop new stories every week, so there's always something coming. I'll see you in the next one.